what makes Crash and Ride unique, other than the fact that I'm a musician talking to musicians, but I was thinking about one of the things I'm proudest of is that you were talking earlier about being comfortable with vulnerability. And there's some episodes of Crash and Ride where me and the guests and all the listeners are just absolutely in tears because I'm not taking a therapeutic distance. I'm usually right there with whoever I'm talking to.
Welcome to the Therapy Show podcast. I'm your host, Lisa Mustard. In each episode, I interview a seasoned and knowledgeable talk therapist from the counseling world to glean valuable insights, techniques, and tools that you can apply to your practice and your life. And if you're considering a career in the counseling field or just want to hear about what it's like to be a talk therapist, then this is the podcast for you. I've made it so convenient for you to obtain your continuing education contact hours. A handful of my episodes are now NBCC approved, and your first one is free. So head to my site, lisamustard.com, enter your email, and you'll receive a code that gives you one free NBCC contact hour. You can listen in your car, on your walk, in between sessions, whenever, wherever. Then when you're ready, just complete the self-study quiz and evaluation. Then you can download your certificate of completion. You guys, this is continuing education on your schedule. No more having to sit at your computer and watch a recorded webinar. Just pop in your earbuds and go. My guest in this week's episode is Patrick Ferguson, a professional musician who has played drums for Vic Chesnutt, Mike Mills of REM, Chuck Leavell of the Allman Brothers and Rolling Stones, the Psychedelic Furs, Athens, Georgia's 5/8, Pinky Doodle Poodle from Tokyo, Japan, and 100 other bands. He has a podcast called Crash and Ride. It's a long-form interview podcast where he talks to musicians who have survived anxiety, depression, addiction, trauma, and any other form of mental illness or mental distress. Patrick began his podcast in March of 2019 and has published weekly since then. However, he did have a brief break when he says he lost his mind during the first month or so of the COVID-19 crisis. Patrick is based out of Athens, Georgia, and constantly on tour when not dealing with a pandemic. And in this episode, he shares his story and how he helps other musicians through his podcast. I want to let you know ahead of time that the audio cuts in and out at times, but my editor, Laura, did a great job of engineering this episode. Okay, let's go ahead and dive into the episode. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of The Therapy Show. I'm your host, Lisa Mustard, and this week's guest, although he is not a licensed therapist, I would definitely give him an honorary degree in some type of counseling because he's got skills. He's got mad skills. He helps a lot of people, a lot of other musicians, and he's also a musician himself. So welcome to the show, Patrick. It's so awesome to have you here.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
You know, I'm not a credentialed and I don't pretend to be a therapist, but my wife and I were just talking last week about the possibility of me enrolling in the LPC certification program at University of Georgia.
Ooh, we're going to make a therapist out of you yet.
You know, the sort of purpose of my podcast, I'm a really strong believer in not giving advice. I feel like when people give advice, they're often talking to their past or future selves. If they're not in a professional capacity, you know, I feel like it's different. People in your field who give advice, it's a different set of rules than just your friends, relations, people you might encounter in like a 12-step program or group therapy environment. Everyone's got advice, but I think it's more important to hear other people's experience, strength, and hope. Mm-hmm. So I have built my podcast around the idea. There were several millennial musicians that I was close friends with. I'm a little older than that, who were really struggling with depression and anxiety. And I didn't feel like advice was going to be useful. So part of the purpose of the Crash and Ride podcast was to create a chorus of voices to sort of show these two young friends of mine that there is a way forward and it does get better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that to me is sort of the strength of Crash and Ride, is that it's so peer-based. But, you know, I have some experience in a therapeutic environment, having, you know, been in therapy off and on since I was very young. And also I'm in recovery.
Nice. Well, I say nice because I'm super impressed by what it is that you're doing. And it takes a lot of vulnerability, you know, to put yourself out there. And I always say that when we're in our vulnerable spaces, we tend to learn the most about ourselves, and we can help others as well. So kudos to you for what you're doing. But, I don't think my listeners know about your show, and they probably don't know who you are and what you've accomplished. Can you just give us a little bit of background on who you are and what you do?
So I've been playing drums since I was really little. I started playing drums when I was like 10 years old. And I've been a professional musician in Athens, Georgia, off and on since the early 90s. I play drums. I played drums with Mike Mills from REM's side project, the Symphonic Project. And last year we were out with Leavell from the Rolling Stones and Allman Brothers. I also played with Vic Chesnutt before he put out Little. I was on a band called Angle Lake with Vic. And I did a year with the Psychedelic Furs. I've been in the power pop band 5/8 from Athens for 30-something years now. And so my own sort of journey in that, kind of my personal journey through a lot of issues with addiction and trauma and depression and anxiety. And it's a sort of unique set of challenges if you're constantly on the move as a musician. Like, it forced me to sort of find a support group in every city, which is great with the 12-step thing, but that's more geared towards substance abuse recovery and not so much towards dealing with depression and anxiety. Although I think it's very myopic to pretend those things aren't all commingled,
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I'm a professional drummer who started a podcast to help his friends survive. I'm not linked in any professional capacity to Nucci Space, the anti-suicide or the suicide prevention charity based in Athens, Georgia, that sort of focuses on Athens, Georgia and Northeast Georgia musicians. But I have a very close relationship with Nucci Space on a personal and emotional level, having benefited from their services myself, but also referred so many friends and other musicians to go down there.
Mm-hmm.
So Nucci Space is a nonprofit based in Athens, Georgia. It was founded by a woman named Linda Phillips. Linda's son, when he was, I think, in his early 20s, succumbed to his battle with depression and took his own life. And, for any parent, that's just like the worst thing imaginable. I can't imagine bouncing back from that, but she channeled her grief and her sadness from that into creating a foundation to benefit musicians, because most of us live without the benefit of any sort of comprehensive health coverage. When you're self-employed, even with the Affordable Care Act, I think affordable might be a slight misnomer there. Mental health care is hard to come by, and so many of us self-medicate with drugs and alcohol. I don't think that was the case with Andre Nucci Phillips, was Linda Phillips' son. I think he was just really struggling with depression. But they created this foundation where there's this building at the core of it that has practice spaces and sort of an ongoing used gear garage sale, and the practice spaces rent by the hour, and the garage sale all help, coupled with donations from local musicians and businesses, to create a fund to subsidize mental health care for musicians. So any musician who lives in Athens or Northeast Georgia, in the Athens area, can walk in there and say, look, I'm in crisis.
Mm-hmm.
I need some help. And they'll refer them to a psychologist who will then, do hourly sessions at a reduced rate or a rate that's subsidized by Nucci Space.
That's so cool. I've been there a couple of times. Our niece, Marissa, got married at Nucci Space. I know you can rent it out. I know she worked there for many years as well. And we've been there a bunch of times. So I know the space. Is there a way that people can kind of donate to Nucci Space all over? I forget. I'm sure they have a link on their website. We could definitely put in the show notes.
Yeah, it's at nuci.org is how you get to Nucci Space. And I had the phone number memorized until 5 seconds ago. I can't remember it. But if you go to the website, nuci.org, it's nucci.org, there's a contact link for email and also a phone number you can call. And financial donations are a huge part of any 501c3. You know how you sort of, if you've worked in the nonprofit sector, you know how you divide your income based on, some is from donations and some is from receipts from whatever your services are. And, there's all these different ways to make money, but they also have a tremendous amount of service opportunities. Mm-hmm. If you're, say, a psychologist or therapist, you could offer to be there for the referral process. You could be someone who does, for lack of a better word, triage. When people walk in, and you could potentially be someone who's on a short note, because a lot of times when you walk into, especially if you're using county-based mental health services, I've experienced this. Somebody walks in the middle of an anxiety attack, and somebody like me says, look, I don't know how much longer I can do this. I'm feeling suicidal. And they go, great. We've got resources for you. We should get you in to see a therapist in 6 months. Right. It's like, yeah, I don't know if I'm going to make it 6 more hours. 6 months is insane.
Right.
So
Yeah.
if someone wanted to sort of get on a list at Nucci Space, I would suggest calling and talking to Bob Sleppy and speaking to him and just say, look, I have some tools. I have some experience. I believe in what you're doing and I would love to help. They might put you on a list to handle those people who walk in and go, look, I'm in really bad shape.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll definitely put all that in the show notes. So therapists out there listening, you can look to the site and see if there is a space for you to maybe volunteer for musicians out there who could really use your help and support. So Patrick, how did you decide? I know you said earlier you had some millennial friends who were dealing with some mental health issues and you wanted to kind of offer them hope and share stories with them of people who've been in their shoes. Tell us about your podcast and who you interview and like how that works. I think it's fascinating and it's really good. You guys, you've got to go and check out Crash and Ride. And of course, I will link to his show in the show notes, but
so much of my experience in the world of recovery and sort of getting through my issues with depression and anxiety involved a lot of, being in vans with other musicians and just talking through stuff. And it's peer based. And I'm a big podcast fan. I was a big Mark Maron guy. I felt like there were times when I wanted to grab Maron, reach to the radio and grab him by his lapels and say, remember that fear is anger. Tell this person that fear is anger. There's so many little things that I've learned through the course of my recovery that have informed my sort of sense of how I got to a place of well-being that I thought this is potentially something that could be useful for musicians. And so I started thinking about doing my own podcast and was weighing different options and ideas. And as a musician, I also have worked as an audio engineer and have had a lot of musicians come through, and I've made friends with a lot of younger musicians. And that ends up being almost kind of a paternal position when you're sort of midwifing someone's vision into the world as a producer or engineer. And there are times, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, people are tired. Their emotions are very close to the surface because that's part of the creative process, right? You really open up that pathway to your sort of innermost thoughts and feelings if you're doing honest, real work. And sometimes stuff comes up and people get emotional. I realized how many of us are walking around with baggage, with pent-up sadness or trauma. And then there was a string of unfortunate musician suicides in 2018. And I thought, man, this is so bad when this happens, And so I was talking to a friend about this idea I had. His name's Jake. He's an amazing drummer. He's from Baltimore. You as a musician, you have this weirdly geographically dispersed group of friends. You have friends in every major city in the country. And Jake and I were talking one day, and he was talking about his journey and how his life before music, it was like the Divide and the Wizard of Oz. Like before music came into his life, everything was black and white. And then he discovered drums and suddenly the whole world kind of clicked into focus. And I was like, I've got to get this on tape. You have to tell this story with a microphone in front of you. And that was the first episode of the podcast. I recorded that. And then I was like, all right, what am I going to do with this? And I built a podcast around that episode.
That's so neat. Oh, I love it. I just think it's so cool. I mean, I don't know of another podcast like yours out there. You just interview all these different types of musicians all over the country. And I'm guessing all over the world now. You just said you had one with an Australia.
This week's episode is with Jim Maloney, who's an amazing drummer from Australia. And also coincidentally, he works at a suicide prevention nonprofit called HALT. And I'm trying to remember something, assistance for local tradies. Tradie is the Australian slang for trades worker. They shorten everything. Yeah. Breakfast is brekkie. Right. Service station is servo, and trades worker is tradie. And they go to work sites with pamphlets like, are you struggling with depression, anxiety, addiction issues? There is help. We have a free breakfast. You can come and get a bacon and egg roll, which is the sort of coin of the realm of tradie conversations. You show up and get a free bacon and egg roll, and they do a 5-minute if you're feeling down and you got some problems, you could come here and we could talk. We could maybe find your therapist, and they do the whole thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have talked to musicians at every level. I have an interview with the former singer and primary songwriter of the band Presidents of the United States of America, which had huge radio hits in the 90s. And I also talked to people who maybe sold, 500 records. When someone when I ask someone if they want to be part of the show, because I believe that they have a compelling story that could help people, it's not on my questionnaire anywhere. Like, how many records have you sold? Like, I don't think that's germane to whether or not they can help people. Mm-hmm. And so I've got this incredibly broad variety of musicians.
That's really cool. That's really cool. Have you had any obstacles as you've worked on your show? Challenges?
Well, the sort of the thing about when you're dealing with underserved populations in the mental health world, and you put a microphone in front of somebody, every now and then it is definitely like a champagne cork. Like they start talking and they have trouble stopping. I've had a couple of like 4.5 hour conversations that I had to like edit down as much as I could. But since I'm a one-man operation, I do all my own editing and all my own recording and everything. Sometimes they just end up being really long.
Yeah. Well, you and I were talking earlier about, even though you're not a therapist, you definitely provide that safe space for people to get it all out. And that's half. That's half of it right there of being a therapist, is being a good listener. So, check one for you right there.
I have 2 huge rules about the Crash and Ride podcast. One is that I always send everybody who's done the show a copy of the episode before I air it and go, listen to this and make sure there's nothing there that you need to call back. Mm-hmm. Because for someone to open their heart, especially about trauma, I mean, oftentimes when someone comes to my house, when I was doing this in person before, I'll give them an espresso. And then just as they're sitting down and putting on headphones, I'll say, okay, you may be tempted to protect someone who has been unkind to you or has hurt you in your life out of force of habit. But remember, if you tell the truth today, you might save somebody's life. And then I hit record.
Super fast.
Yeah. And that combined with, 60 to 90 milligrams of caffeine, I get some real truths out of people. But I always send them the episode. Right. Before I broadcast it, because I want them to feel completely safe in everything that they say. Mm-hmm. And the second big rule is I don't want anyone to ever feel judged on my show, because it's not why I do it. Right. I definitely don't want anyone to ever regret coming on to Crash and Ride, because the last thing I want to do is shut somebody down from addressing their mental health stuff. Because we all walk around, so many of us, especially in the professional capacity of musicians, we have to present this incredibly marketable persona if we're a session person. Mm-hmm. Like, no one's going to want to take me on a bus tour if they know that I'm like cataleptic with depression.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that makes sense, and you probably don't want to be going on tour if that's the, your symptoms are that exacerbated. That's not, the best environment, probably, I'm guessing, for you to be in.
Well, but it's definitely not a great environment if you're struggling, because there's so many opportunities to use drugs and drink too much. But you also have to work, because otherwise you run out of money.
Yeah, it's your livelihood. You're right. So right. I totally understand that. That would be tough. And that's a world I don't know, because that's not my profession. That's not like how I earn, but I do understand that it's all about self-care too. As a therapist, like I have to make sure that I'm in a good place so I can help other people. And sometimes that can be hard when I have my own stressors going on and pandemics happening around us. Right. So it's I think, for me, that message is, if you don't take care of yourself, you're not good for, you got to put your oxygen mask on first. Like what they say when you get on the airplane, that's so important. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's wise advice.
I don't think that the jobs are as different as you would think looking at them, though, because both as a therapist and as a musician, you deal in the currency of emotion. Like, I feel like viewing art, any kind of art, cinema, live theater, going to a museum and look at sculpture or paintings, is activating the mirror neurons in your brain that are the sort of the core of empathy, right? I know there's been a substantial body of research on the brain processes of mirror neurons and sort of why we have emotional experiences watching other people have an emotional life. Why we, like, if we watch Hamlet, we sort of get an idea of the anxiety and the jeopardy that he feels like he's in, suspecting that his uncle has murdered his father, etc. And I feel like that in good art, especially music, because it is such a manifestation of emotion in time. That's my definition of music.
Mm.
using sound, right? We decorate visual spaces with art. We decorate time with music. It's the sort of same thing. But if you're a good performer and you're honest, and you create an environment where people feel comfortable feeling their feelings, like you give people an opportunity to experience their emotions. That's why the lights are so dim at Willie Nelson concerts. So, these like former factory workers and longshoremen and mail carriers and people who are in sort of traditionally stoic industries with big wizard beards, can like cry into their beer as Willie Nelson sings Crazy or Blue Eyes Crying in the Rain without feeling like exposed or vulnerable in a way that they're uncomfortable with. And I feel like that's so similar to the environment in a therapist's office. Like you create this environment where people won't feel judged, they feel accepted, and they feel encouraged to have their emotions, because so much of life discourages people from feeling their emotions, and then you end up conflicted.
Mm-hmm. No, you're right. I like that parallel. I think that's a good way of, putting it. And half of the time, especially in the work that I do, because I work for a military branch primarily, I'm brought into situations where emotions are running high and there's a lot of stress. And it would be really easy for me to react with my own stress of being in that moment with all the stress going around. But what I have to do is work really hard just to show up without judgment, without any type of agenda, without any preconceived notion, and just be in the room and be in the space with the person who's dealing. And so I can definitely see the similarities. It's different. I don't have a musical bone in me, but and just ask Billy, my husband, and he'd be like, no, don't let her sing or touch an instrument. It's interesting that you are able to show me that, because I never really thought about it like that before. So I like that new perspective. Thank you.
I have several things sprang to mind as you were speaking just now. One is that I have an episode that I haven't released that's in the can where I talk to a military veteran about some PTSD issues. His wife is one of the sort of leading sort of PTSD practitioners in their area, which is in Texas near one of the big military bases. But I didn't feel like his episode went that well because it mostly ended up being him. One of the things, so I grew up in a military family. My father's a Vietnam vet. My uncle's a Vietnam vet. So many of my friends growing up near Fort Benning in Georgia, I had tons of friends who were combat veterans in my 20s and 30s. And so one of the sort of most frequent manifestations I see of that trauma is this like incredibly aggressive front towards the world. Like a lot of loud motorcycles, a lot of visible firearms, a lot of tattoos, And I interviewed this guy, and I was really excited to do it. And his wife was also on. She's this sort of PTSD therapist. And I feel like it was a great episode. Like his whole manifestation in the course of the episode was very sort of like, it was just very aggressive, very sort of chest thrown out. Like, I don't know how to characterize it other than to say that it didn't feel like it was going to be something that called other veterans who were struggling to a place where they could feel like they were ready to be in a therapeutic environment.
Yeah.
But, the other thing you said about not being able to sing is I don't believe anybody is unable to sing. I just don't feel like we have enough sing-alongs. And this is not something that I've been able to successfully implement in my life, except with my wife and daughter. But like getting out the acoustic guitar and having everybody sing allows you to kind of hear your voice and work with it. It's like when someone says, I can't sing, what I hear is I haven't sung in an environment where I felt comfortable doing it enough.
Yeah, that's true.
Same with therapy.
Yeah.
People need to feel not judged. Like if I was like, to point at you and go, sing happy birthday, you'd be like, oh God, just me? I've just got to sing happy birthday?
Right.
But if there were like 20 people in a room singing Danny Boy, like they do in every Irish pub on Saturday night in the entire world, eventually you'd become more comfortable in your voice.
True. Yeah, I guess that would be like if we were all sitting around and I pointed my finger at you and said, Patrick, share your trauma story. I'd be like, what? Versus somebody who has been prepped and knows how to share what they've gone through with some hope and some, I don't know what the word is, just being able to give hope and telling their story. You would feel a lot more comfortable maybe than sharing. So
it's all about frameworks and not feeling judged, right? Do you know Nadine Burke-Harris?
That name's familiar. I don't know.
She's now Surgeon General in California. She's, I think, the first state Surgeon General in California. Gavin Newsom appointed her because of her incredible work with trauma. And she's got a clinic in Oakland, California, and she's dealing with a lot of, kids who've been affected by, all the issues that come along with poverty and how they tend to create an environment where trauma is a lot more common. Anyway, I saw her TED talk and was so moved by it. I mean, I'm not big into celebrity culture because as a drummer, I've been able to play with a lot of people that normally I'd be like, oh my God, it's the dude from the Rolling Stones. But then I played with him and it was so fun and great. But there are a few people I would cheerfully jump on a hand grenade for Dr. Harris. I think she's brilliant. And the work she's doing is so important. But I think that a part of her research is on physical health outcomes from trauma, early life trauma, especially about how it shortens life expectancy. And there's certain health outcomes that seem to manifest, especially around thyroid stuff and adrenal stuff with people who've lived with anxiety for so long, that they get anhedonia and depression and anxiety just because their amplifier's been on 11 for 20 years or whatever. And I'm sort of beginning to formulate a theory. I'm seeing a recurring theme on the podcast of people with substance abuse issues who had undiagnosed or even diagnosed or who had early life ADD or ADHD issues. And I'm wondering if that self-medication isn't part of dealing with the trauma of constantly struggling to stay connected with your environment, especially in the sort of Prussian model school system that we have, where people supposed to be able to sit still and pay attention. And that's the hardest thing in the world for me and always was. Yeah. And I wonder if some of my early life anxiety doesn't somehow bear a relationship to just constantly suddenly realizing, oh, I'm in a classroom and I don't know what's happening.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that makes sense to me. I can see how that could be, some making experiences as a child. If you aren't able to, feel like you can focus and sit still, and then you constantly get reinforced by a teacher in your, developmental years that because you can't sit still, that means you are inherently a bad person or whatever that message might be, that's gonna stick with you. And eventually you're gonna, possibly learn some different coping skills. And
right.
Yeah, no, that wouldn't surprise me. Hey friend, want to be more comfortable while sitting on the therapy couch? I sure did, and went looking for pants and tops that were soft, wrinkle resistant, and would match just about anything I already had in my closet. And now Zaya Active makes up about 80% of my wardrobe. Would you like to learn more? Head over to my site, lisamustard.com, and click on the Activewear tab. And don't think this is just for women. They have men's and kids' clothes too, and our family is loving the quality, and I am loving the price tags. So head over to my site to check it all out.
Yeah, part of my theory I have this idea about the ADD to entrepreneur pipeline. Like, you aren't really a team player because you're incapable of sitting quietly and focusing in a group. And so many of the people who I know who became professional musicians who were self-employed did so because most work environments were impossible for them.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I can understand that.
Yeah.
I can totally understand.
Honestly, I feel like my podcast is nibbling around the edges of all. I sometimes wish I had a partner with more experience who I could go to and go, well, what do you think of this?
Yeah. Well,
because it's all, it's new every day to me.
Well, maybe we could find you somebody you could consult with out there listening.
Oh man, that'd be so great.
So any therapists out there who specialize in trauma or ADHD or musicians, feel free to reach out to Patrick. I hope that's okay. I just put that out there.
Oh yeah. Patrick Ferguson at protonmail.com is my personal address, and all the show email goes to crashandride@protonmail.com.
Well, we will definitely, I'll put that in the show notes. If you guys want to reach out to Patrick and maybe offer your support, I'm sure he would. Sounds like he's open to it. That's cool.
Totally.
Tell me about your coffee. You have a coffee line that goes with the podcast?
I believe that, speaking of self-medicating ADD and depression, I start every day with 2 whopping espressos. And I have a friend who works at Jittery Joe's and is good friends with your brother-in-law, Charlie. And I've known Charlie since Marissa and Blake were they were the cutest kids.
They were.
They looked like the Campbell Soup kids. They had little round faces. And, they were adorable. I remember when they were just babies and I would see Pick and Charlie out pushing them around in the stroller. And I was like, man, you guys made some amazing looking kids.
Yeah.
So I've known Charlie for years. I'm a big coffee guy, and I use coffee both medicinally to sort of jumpstart my day. But also, I just love coffee so much. And Stephen, who is the taste profiler and sort of, he's the sort of bean guy for all things Three Joe's now. So we should have a Crash and Ride espresso. And I was like, oh man, I'm so into that. So he has blended organic Guatemalan, I think Mexican bean and something else. And he's made an espresso that is just delight. And I had to make it. You know what a mocha pot is? You know mocha pot? They're like a 3-piece steel thing that goes on the stove. Sometimes it's aluminum.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Got a little black knob on the top, and then it's silver. And they make them in Italy, and they're real Art Deco looking.
Yeah,
I love them.
Cool.
That's what I said, man, you got to make it so that it tastes good in the mocha pot, because that's how I make my coffee. And he just like dialed it in perfectly. I'm so happy with it. And you can get Crash and Ride espresso. You can get it off Hendershot's website right now, hendershotsathens.com. Of course, Hendershot's is a local coffee shop here in Athens, Georgia. And like every small business right now is trying to be creative about ways to keep the doors open and survive this pandemic thing. And so he's selling my espresso and 2 other Athens bands, Widespread Panic and Kishibashi. They have coffee that they're selling off the Hendershot's website. So if you want to try the Crash and Ride espresso, Seth is being super careful about gloving up and disinfecting when he packs everything. And he's sending out cans of either whole bean or ground cans of espresso. So yeah, highly recommend it.
Yeah, it's some good stuff. That Jittery Joe's, they know how to make some coffee, those guys. Totally shameless plug for my brother-in-law, Charlie Mustard. He's listening. And that's how I discovered you, was like, I don't know, 2-3 weeks ago. We were down in Edisto, and my brother-in-law, Charlie, who you're friends with, I don't know, he brought it up. He said, oh, my friend Patrick has a podcast called Crash and Ride. And I was like, cool. And I stole upstairs and away from everybody and just started looking at it and was like, oh my gosh, he talks about mental health issues and musicians. And I was like, I knew that I wanted to have you, come onto the show for that reason, number one. And number two, we love Athens. We love everything Athens, of course. One of my favorite towns in the world, going to Athens, Georgia. So I'm just so grateful that you have been able to come onto the show and share about your podcast. And do you feel like you have a mission with your podcast?
Oh yeah. My mission is to make sure as many of my friends get old as possible.
I like that. Yeah.
We've all been to too many funerals.
That's awesome. Great mission.
Yeah. I mean, musician is a pretty working class existence these days, despite it's often the most downwardly mobile profession I can think of. Lots of middle class kids become musicians and then they become bartenders or dishwashers. Right. But earlier you mentioned something I've been thinking about, like what makes Crash and Ride unique, other than the fact that I'm a musician talking to musicians. But I was thinking about one of the things I'm proudest of is that you were talking earlier about being comfortable with vulnerability, and there's some episodes of Crash and Ride where me and the guests and all the listeners are just absolutely in tears, because like I'm not taking a therapeutic distance. Like I'm usually right there with whoever I'm talking to. I think, I had mentioned earlier I was considering becoming a licensed therapist, but one of my big concerns is I don't really have a big empathy gap. Maybe a professional framework will allow me to be more sort of clinical about it. But I think about these experiences I've had talking to these people. Episode 5 is Grant Curry, and episode 9 is Evan Rowe, and they're 2 of my closest friends in the world. And both of them had suicide attempts, and both of them talked very candidly about that in the episode. And, Evan's episode 9, he's now doing the ketamine nasal spray that a lot of people who are therapy resistant and drug resistant or SSRI resistant have gone to. But he didn't reveal that until he had been talking for about an hour. And through the course of the hour that preceded it, I was starting to think, Evan is using my show as a suicide note. Like his affect was so low and he seemed so sad that I thought, I got to call 911 or something. Right. Like this guy's going to go home and do something terrible. Yeah. Because he had been doing therapy, did not work for him. He had really a lot of tremendous trauma as a child. And you should listen to the episode. Yeah. He had a very violent childhood, and he was therapy resistant. SSRIs usually work for him for about 2 months, and then they taper, and then he's in despair again. And then they started doing electroconvulsive therapy, and that worked for a number of years, but that's so devastating to your daily life, you know. And then that stopped working, and that's when I thought,
Yeah.
this isn't going anywhere good, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then he revealed that his therapist had suggested doing the ketamine infusion, and it was instantaneous. Within 48 hours, his suicidal ideation had subsided for the first time since he was like 14.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
He was doing the infusions at first, you know, at the infusion center with the hanging bag and all that. And then because it's cost prohibitive, and he was part of a pilot study, I think at Duke or something, that became too expensive. And his doctor was like, let's try the nasal spray.
Mm-hmm.
So nasal spray is working.
Good. That's really awesome. That's great to hear.
Well, and then someone emailed me after that show came out and said, I went to my doctor and I got the ketamine nasal spray and it's saving my life.
Yeah. It's incredible what it can do for people. It really is. And it's becoming one of those alternative therapies that a lot of people are turning to. You know, there's psilocybin, there's MDMA that's come, you know, all this research is coming out. And I have a feeling the future of mental health care and treatment is going to look so different. And it's going to be here before we know it. So I think that's great. So he's doing all right. He's doing better, I guess.
He's doing great. At some point, he's a drummer too, and we were joking about getting rooked by the name Cymbalta. It's like, it's got cymbal in it. It's got to be for drummers, but it didn't really work well for him. And something happened with he was on Cymbalta, and then his metabolism, he was metabolizing it at like twice the normal rate. And so he would take a Cymbalta in the morning, and then around 2:00 or 3:00 in the afternoon, have the brain flashes.
Oh.
And then have this incredible, like, dark downturn of mood. So he tapered off the Cymbalta, and he was taking something else that slowed down the metabolization of the ketamine. Can't remember what it was now. It's not a steroid. It was something else. Some other drug that you would think, oh, wow, that's weird. But his doctor's really working with him, and he's doing really well.
Well, good. Well, I definitely want, if folks are interested in that episode, we can link to that Crash and Ride episode for sure.
Let me correct what I said earlier. Evan Rowe's episode is episode 10.
Okay.
Episode 9 was an interview with an Englishman. And, you know, Sigmund Freud once said that the Irish are immune to psychoanalysis. You know, that may be apocryphal. I'm not positive. But I think the English are immune to talk therapy because they just sit there with a stiff upper lip and pretend it's not happening.
Yeah, maybe. I have some British friends. That sounds about right. No, I'm just kidding. If they're listening.
Yeah, it is Freud. Freud, Irish. Was Freud right? Is psychoanalysis of no use to the Irish? Anyway.
So what's next for your show? You have anything that you're working on that's coming?
I've got a couple of people I really want to talk to, and I'm sort of working up to a level of prestige where I can come to someone and say, hey, I do this podcast, and hopefully they'll say, oh yeah, I've heard of it. I was wondering you were going to ask me. I can't wait to go back to in-person interviews. I find them way more rewarding than doing it over Skype or Zoom or whatever. Mm-hmm. But I'm just going to keep doing it. There's a couple of projects I kind of want to take on that are podcast-based that aren't really related to Crash and Ride. And then when the world kind of abandoned New York City, because if you're not sort of familiar with the circumstances around that, at one point, New York City's like trash collection and paramedic and police, everybody was on strike, or there were just neighborhoods that were completely ignored, parts of Harlem, parts of Brooklyn. And these volunteer ambulance services popped up. Mm-hmm. This was right in the middle of the AIDS crisis, and another thing that was happening, and people don't really talk about this much anymore, but there was a terrible prejudice about dealing with people who were sick with the AIDS virus because we weren't sure how it was transmitted. This may sound familiar to what this year that we're having right now, but I want to do a podcast on the Greenpoint Volunteer Ambulance Service.
Interesting.
It's a lot of local people who, they bought an old surplus ambulance or two because people were getting shot and then lying on the pavement for an hour waiting for the city to respond. And so all of these bars and, clubs and stuff, they would have Greenpoint Volunteer Ambulance Service, phone number by the door. So instead of waiting on the city of New York to respond at a time when the services there were stressed or under resourced or whatever, they just call someone from the neighborhood.
Right. Yeah, that's fascinating. I didn't know anything about that. So definitely. Well, before we go, is there anything else that you would like to share with our listeners today?
Just being safe and making time for their families coming into the holidays, and understanding that this year, an empty seat at Thanksgiving means that seat will be filled next year. Right now I'm in Indianapolis. We came up here to be closer to my wife's family, and they've been isolating super hardcore, and we isolated super hardcore. We should have seen us trying to get up here without going in anywhere. But I interviewed that guy. This week's episode is an interview with a guy who lives in Western Australia, and they had 12 cases on the day that he and I spoke in the whole province of COVID-19. And we're not there yet, and I just hope people can pull it together. And other than that, support local music. All music is local music at some stage,
Yeah.
Every band comes from somewhere. And yeah, I'm a big believer that if you don't support the arts, they will go away.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks again for being here, Patrick. I've really enjoyed getting to know you, learning more about your show. And everybody, you guys, go and subscribe to the Crash and Ride podcast. Listen to Patrick interview these amazing musicians, sharing their stories, giving hope and sharing strengths of recovery and wellness. The model of wellness. Patrick is definitely a great role model for that. And, being able to take what you've experienced and turn it into such a wonderful way to give back and sharing these stories. And I definitely think you need to go back and get your degree. I think that's the next step.
There's a program at UGA that it's actually a 2-year program I'm thinking about signing up for. It's a big commitment. For musicians, our commitment tends to be, whatever the gig calendar is about 3 months out. And past that, it's like, I don't know, so to say for 2 years, it's like, wow, that's a lot of time. Yeah, it's a master's with an emphasis in incarcerated populations, which is something I hold really near and dear to my heart. I've had a couple of ex-cons on the podcast, and I've never asked one when the microphones were on, but, we've been rolling cables and packing up, and I've been like, hey, when you were in prison, if you look around the population of the prison, what percentage would you say is actually in there for criminal reasons, and how many are in there because of crimes related to poverty and substance abuse and mental health issues and addiction issues? And like, how many people really need to be in prison, and how many are just there because we don't have any other means to deal with those issues? And he was like, he's super country. His name's Boo Ray. He's a singer-songwriter from Nashville. He goes, I don't know, man, if I'm being generous, I'd say 20%. I was like, I was going to guess 15. He's like, I said I was being generous. But there's a movie called The Work that's about a volunteer group of therapists and other volunteers that go into San Quentin prison in Southern California. Is it San Quentin? I think it's San Quentin. And if you can watch The Work, I highly recommend it. They do a lot of like head on, like let's find that one pivotal traumatic event that changed the course of your life that you ended up in a maximum security prison.
Right.
And the people who've gone through The Work, the program that they do, have had a like single digit percent of recidivism, maybe 0. I can't remember, but yeah. So this program at UGA deals with incarcerated populations, children of trauma, substance abuse issues with a heavy emphasis on social justice. And I'm like, that's my wheelhouse, let's do this.
Sign me up. Yep. Sign me up. So in the near future, we will be able to refer patients to you, Patrick. That's exciting. I'm glad that, you've shared all of this today on the show. This has just been awesome. So thank you again for being here. I talk with so many therapists who are wanting to transition to coaching. And I want to share with you guys, if you are considering adding coaching into your practice, you need to check out my friend Lee McDonough's Coach with Clarity program. She supports service-oriented helping professionals in developing their coaching mastery and helps them build sustainable coaching businesses. And she's also the host of the Coach with Clarity podcast. Her Coach with Clarity membership is an ICF accredited continuing coach education program that blends coaching, skill building, and business support. Lee has weekly live calls, a toolkit of coaching specific resources, including an attorney prepared coaching contract template, and a community of coaches to cheer you on. It's everything you need to build, grow, or scale your coaching practice. You can learn more about Lee and her program at coachwithclarity.com. Well, that wraps up another episode of The Therapy Show with Lisa Mustard. I know there are hundreds of thousands of podcasts out there, and I'm thankful you've chosen to listen to mine.
Be sure to visit lisamustard.com to access the show notes and discover more fantastic content.
And I'd be grateful if you subscribe to the show. Thank you.